Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold trained 6 days a week, twice a day, hitting every body part directly at least twice in that same week, and the sheer volume of that approach is the first thing that gets lost when people talk about his physique instead of his actual training log. The structure ran as a double split, chest and back in the morning, shoulders and arms in the evening one day, legs in the morning, abs in the evening the next. Then repeat the entire rotation before taking a single rest day. Within a chest and back session alone, Arnold would run through 5 or 6 different exercises per body part, often 20 total sets for a muscle group in one sitting, a volume load that would bury most modern lifters attempting it cold. Here's the training principle underneath all that volume that actually explains why it worked. Arnold trained antagonist muscle pairs together in the same session, chest paired with back, biceps paired with triceps, specifically because blood flow to one muscle group during work continues into the immediately following opposing muscle group set. He and his training partners describe this explicitly as chasing the pump, and modern research on blood flow and muscle protein synthesis actually supports the underlying logic. Sustained blood flow to a muscle during and after training is tied to greater anabolic signaling. What set his approach apart from pure bodybuilding programs of the same era was refusing to skip heavy compound work in favor of only isolation movements. Squats, deadlifts, and heavy presses stayed in his program throughout his competitive career, not just early on, treating raw strength as the foundation size gets built on top of rather than something to abandon once a certain size was reached. Franco Columbu. Franco Columbu was a competitive powerlifter before he was ever a bodybuilder, and that background shows up directly in how differently his training approached strength compared to most of his bodybuilding peers at the time. Where most of the golden era trained almost exclusively in moderate rep ranges built around pump and volume, Columbu regularly worked in genuinely heavy, low rep ranges on his main lifts, squat, bench, and deadlift, treating raw strength development as inseparable from size development rather than a separate pursuit. He held official powerlifting records in multiple weight classes during his competitive years, numbers that stood alongside a physique built well enough to win Mr. Olympia twice. Here's the training principle this actually demonstrates, one that gets debated constantly in modern fitness spaces. Heavy low-rep strength training and hypertrophy-focused training aren't mutually exclusive pursuits competing for the same recovery resources. They're complementary when programmed correctly. Columbu's approach essentially ran a strength-focused, lower rep phase on his main compound lifts, then layered higher rep, more classically bodybuilding-style accessory work on top of that same session, giving his physique both the density that heavy strength training produces and the fuller muscle bellies that higher rep volume work builds. The lesson that gets lost in translation from his era to today is that Columbu never treated strength numbers as separate from his physique goals, worth chasing on its own. Strength was the base his size was built from, and abandoning heavy compound work in favor of pure isolation and pump work would have cost him the very foundation his physique depended on: Zane. Frank Zane won Mr. Olympia 3 times while being noticeably smaller than most of the competitors he beat, and his training philosophy explains exactly why raw size was never actually his target in the first place. Zane trained with meaningfully lower total volume than most of his golden era peers, often in the 10 to 12 total working set range per body part rather than the 20+ sets common among bulkier competitors of the same era, and he combined that lower volume with an intense focus on strict form and what he explicitly called mind-muscle connection, consciously feeling the target muscle work through every single rep rather than simply moving the weight from point A to point B. Here's the actual training principle behind why this produced a genuinely different physique outcome than higher volume programs did. Zane trained specifically to maximize the aesthetic proportions of his physique, tapering his waist, widening his shoulders and lats, prioritizing symmetry and visual lines over sheer muscle mass, and his training reflected that priority directly. Exercise selection leaned heavily on movements that carved specific detail and shape into a muscle, side laterals and cable work for shoulder width, vacuum poses and controlled ab work for waist tightness, rather than simply chasing the heaviest possible weight on the biggest compound lifts. What modern lifters chasing pure aesthetics tend to miss from Zane's approach is that lower volume, done with genuinely maximal focus and mind-muscle connection on each rep, isn't actually a lesser training stimulus than higher volume. It's a different tool aimed at a different outcome: precision and shape rather than maximum possible mass. Platz. Platz built the single most famous set of legs in bodybuilding history, and the training behind them is still discussed today, specifically because of how far it pushed leg training past what almost anyone else was willing to attempt. His signature session included squatting for genuinely high rep sets, 20 reps or more at weights most lifters could barely manage for 5, on top of an already brutal total leg volume that regularly included multiple additional quad and hamstring exercises in the same session. Platz trained legs with an intensity and total workload that, by most accounts, from training partners and observers at the time, exceeded what nearly any of his competitors were doing for any single body part in their entire program. Here's the actual training principle his approach demonstrates beyond just he worked harder. High rep squatting under a genuinely heavy load creates an unusually severe combination of mechanical tension and metabolic stress simultaneously, the 2 primary drivers of muscle hypertrophy according to modern exercise science. A 20 rep squat set forces you to maintain real, heavy load through the entire set rather than dropping to a genuinely light weight the way most high-rep training does, meaning both tension and metabolic fatigue stacked together rather than one being sacrificed for the other. What gets lost when people try to imitate this directly is the sheer work capacity Platz built up over years, specifically to tolerate this volume without breaking down. This wasn't a program a beginner could safely copy on day one. It was the product of a body that had adapted over years to handle a training load that would injure most lifters attempting to jump straight into it. Sergio Oliva. Sergio Oliva trained with an intuitive, feel-based approach that stood in the sharp contrast to the more rigidly structured programs some of his competitors followed, and that flexibility is exactly what a lot of his training partners pointed to when explaining his longevity in the sport. Rather than following a fixed program with predetermined sets and reps for every session, Oliva adjusted his training day to day based on how his body actually felt and responded. Sometimes pushing a muscle group with significantly more volume than planned if it felt particularly responsive that day, and pulling back noticeably if fatigue or joint discomfort showed up. This autoregulation, adjusting training load based on real-time feedback rather than a fixed spreadsheet, is a concept modern sports science has since formalized and validated as a legitimate way to manage training stress across a long career. Here's the actual principle underneath his approach that explains why it worked as well as it did. Rigid programs assume every training day arrives with identical recovery status, which is rarely true in reality. Sleep, stress, and nutrition all shift how much a body can genuinely handle on any given day. An intuitive, feel-based approach lets a lifter push harder, specifically on days their body can actually absorb more stimulus, and back off on days it can't, rather than blindly following a predetermined number regardless of readiness. The risk with this approach, and the reason it isn't universally recommended, is that it depends heavily on genuinely honest self-assessment, something that took Oliva years of training experience to develop accurately. Newer lifters attempting pure autoregulation without that experience often mistake simple discomfort for genuine fatigue, or mistake genuine fatigue for laziness, undermining the entire premise the approach depends on. Haney. Haney won 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, more than any bodybuilder before him, and he did it while openly building his entire training philosophy around a single phrase he repeated constantly to anyone who asked, "Train, don't strain." Where a lot of his era pushed training to genuine failure on nearly every set, chasing the absolute limit of what a muscle could handle in a single session, Haney deliberately stopped most working sets 1 or 2 reps short of true failure, prioritizing consistent, sustainable training across an entire year, over maximizing the stimulus of any single session. His stated reasoning was straightforward. A career built on constant all-out effort accumulates joint and connective tissue damage that eventually forces time off, and time off training consistently is worse for long-term size than slightly undertraining any individual session. Here's the actual training principle this demonstrates, one that's gained significant traction in modern sports science under a different name. Training to failure on every set produces measurably more acute fatigue and requires longer recovery windows than stopping a rep or two short, while research comparing the two approaches over longer training blocks has generally found similar long-term hypertrophy outcomes between the two, provided total volume stays comparable across the training block. Haney essentially traded a small amount of stimulus per individual set for a dramatically larger amount of total, sustainable training volume across months and years. What his 8 consecutive titles actually demonstrate is that maximizing every single session isn't the same thing as maximizing a career, and the difference between those two goals is exactly where his training philosophy lived. Ronnie Coleman. Ronnie Coleman built one of the most massive physiques bodybuilding has ever seen by combining genuinely heavy powerlifting style weight with genuinely high bodybuilding style volume, a combination almost nobody else in the sport's history has sustained at the level he did. His training log included working sets on major compound lifts, squats, deadlifts, barbell rows, at weights that would be considered legitimately impressive in a pure powerlifting competition, not just a bodybuilding gym, all performed for the moderate 6 to 10 rep ranges typically associated with hypertrophy training, rather than the low 1 to 3 rep ranges powerlifters usually chase those same numbers with. Here's the actual principle underneath why this combination produced such extreme size specifically. Heavier absolute weight at a moderate rep range creates substantially more mechanical tension per rep than lighter weight at the same rep range, and mechanical tension is one of the primary drivers of muscle growth according to current hypertrophy research. Coleman wasn't simply doing more sets than his competitors. He was applying meaningfully heavier load to each of those sets, essentially stacking a stronger stimulus onto an already high total volume, rather than choosing between heavy weight and high volume the way most programs implicitly force lifters to. The trade-off this approach demands gets left out of the highlight reels people remember him for. Sustaining genuinely heavy weight across genuinely high volume places enormous cumulative stress on joints and connective tissue over a career, and Coleman has been open in interviews about the physical toll that combination eventually took on his body, a direct consequence of the same training approach that built the size in the first place. Greene. Greene became known for a training style built almost entirely around what he called feeling the muscle work. a deliberately slow, controlled approach that stood apart from the faster, heavier training common among his competitors during the same era. Greene frequently trained with lighter relative loads than his physique size would suggest, prioritizing extremely deliberate, controlled tempo through both the lifting and lowering phase of a rep, sometimes pausing at the point of peak contraction to intensify the muscle's engagement before continuing. His stated approach centered on treating the mind-muscle connection as the primary training variable, deliberately slowing everything down, specifically to maximize how directly he could feel and control the target muscle work, rather than treating weight on the bar as the main measure of a good set. Here's the actual principle this style demonstrates, and it's more substantiated by research than it might initially sound. Studies specifically measuring muscle activation through electromyography have found that consciously focusing attention on the target muscle during a lift measurably increases activation of that muscle compared to simply focusing on moving the weight, even at identical loads. Slowing tempo down independently increases total time under tension per set, another variable directly tied to hypertrophy signaling in current exercise science research, meaning Greene's approach was stacking two separate research-supported mechanisms into a single training style. The trade-off worth understanding is that this approach generally requires lighter, absolute loads to maintain that level of control and pause, meaning raw strength numbers typically take a backseat to muscle-focused execution. A deliberate choice for a physique-focused training philosophy, but one that wouldn't suit a lifter whose primary goal is maximal strength.